Good morning. Hope and pray that you're having a wonderful day. This is Jack Abels again, and I shared some with you last week about a day in the life of Jesus, and we used Mark chapter 1, verses 16 to 35, to just see how he responded to the busyness of his life, and maybe how we need to respond to the busyness of ours. We need to pray more. We need to pray more like Jesus prayed. Well, today, since it is what we call Palm Sunday, I would like to go and look at that event. And so today's lesson, last week was a day in the life of Jesus. This week is up and then down the mountain. Sound fair? And the reason why I want to look at this is next week I want us to look at the passion of Jesus giving his life for us, and then on the first day of the week, rising just by the power of a sinless, indestructible life. But I really want us to see, this celebration, this rejoicing today, because without the rejoicing that we see in this week, the first day of the Passion Week, I guess, we miss out on the real purpose, I guess, the depth of the rejection when they cry out, crucify him, crucify him. But that'll be next week. So today, we're going to start in Bethany. And the reason why you start in Bethany is that's where Jesus starts on Saturday morning, Sunday morning, Tuesday morning, Wednesday morning, Thursday morning. He starts in Bethany because he spends the night there. And we know that he spent the night there Friday night. We know that Mary takes out her jar of perfume and anoints Jesus for burial. We know about the argument with Judas and the disciples saying, hey, he should use this to help out the poor. But anyway, on this Sunday morning, he rises early and he starts heading up the mountain. Now, the mountain he's heading up is called the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is like a little over 2 mile long ridge, mostly north-south, leaning a little bit to the north-northeast. But this is long ridge that's about, almost 2,700 feet in elevation. So it's taller than Jerusalem. So up on the Mount of Olives, you can look down on Jerusalem. And so he's heading from Bethany up the Mount of Olives. But before he goes all the way up the mountain, along the way, he takes two of the disciples. He says, I got a job for you. I want you to go on to this next little village up here, and about, a little over 3/4 of the way up the mountain, not quite to the top of the mountain, not quite to the top of this long ridge that goes back and forth, about almost the top of the mountain is this little village of Bethpage. And so that's where we're going to begin. So I'd like we could read it in Matthew 21. We could read it also in Mark 11. We could read it in Luke 19 or in John 12. John leaves out this part. And so we're going to read it in Mark since we read in Mark last week. Okay? So in Mark, I'm going to start reading in Mark 11. It says, as they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethpage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples saying, go to the village ahead of you, and just as you enter it, you'll find a colt tied there, which no one's ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. And if anyone asks you, why are you doing this? Tell them the Lord needs it. And they'll send it back here. And we'll send it back here shortly. Okay, I want you to be one of those two guys. We don't know if it's Peter and James. We don't know if it's Matthew and Bartholomew. Anyway, it's two of the disciples. So two of these disciples start heading up this hill ahead of, kind of walking on ahead. And he says, when you get to this next village up here, you're going to see, just as you come into town, you're going to see a stable. And in this little stable, you're going to see a donkey with her colt tied next to her. And just go and take it. What? You want us to go steal somebody's donkey colt? No. Just go take it. And if anybody asks you, just tell them the Lord needs it. And I just want to picture myself being one of these two guys. And so we're going up to Bethpage, and just as you get into town, there's this donkey, sure enough, and she's tied there with her colt. And this colt, no one has ever ridden on this colt. You don't just ride donkey colts, but we'll get to that later. Well, anyway, so they come up to this donkey colt, and they start untying him. And as they do, somebody sees them and says, hey, what are you doing? Okay, well, let's read. They were saying, man, I hope nobody sees us. I hope nobody sees us. But somebody saw him. So let's read. It says, verse 4, so they went and found the colt outside the street, tied at a doorway. And as they untied it, some people standing there asked, what are you doing untying that colt? When they answered, as the Lord told them to. The Lord needs it. Okay? And the people let him go. I'd be sweating bullets, wouldn't you? I mean, here's his job. We want you to take this colt. So they go and they get this colt. And sure enough, hey, what are you doing? Well, the Lord needs it. Okay. Said, okay, take it. And so I would be filled with awe. How does Jesus know all that? He's Jesus. He knows all that. He knows what you're going through. He knows what it's like for you to be stuck in a house for weeks and weeks with just your immediate family or alone, and only going out with a mask and getting necessities and coming back in and not being allowed to visit people that you want to visit. He knows. He knew what they were going to say about the donkey colt. He knows what we're going through. All right? So let's go on. They take the colt, they bring it to Jesus. And it says, starting now, I'm starting in verse 7. It says, when they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks over it, he sat on it. And many people spread their cloaks on the road, while others spread branches they had cut in the fields. All right? Here's a donkey no one's ever sat on. You don't just ride a donkey, but Jesus just climbs on it and rides. And donkeys aren't mules. They're little short guys. If I sat on a donkey, my feet would drag on the ground, or pretty close. And a colt, they definitely would. So you kind of have to almost pull your feet up. So it's a very humbling position. That's why in Zechariah 9:9, the prophet said, behold, your king comes unto you, humble and lowly, and riding upon a colt, the foal of a donkey. It's very humbling to ride on a colt, the foal of a donkey. But that's how he chooses. That's how he chooses to enter the city of Jerusalem. So he comes in on this donkey colt. Now, to add to that, here's what you would think a skittish animal that no one's ever ridden on, and now people are all around it. How do even trained animals do when they're just surrounded by people? Not too well. But this one is meek. This one knows who's riding on him. This one knows that it's the Creator, and he will do whatever he wants because he will submit to Jesus. The word meek isn't weak. The word meek is the word under the control of. A horse, when it's meek, isn't weaker than it was, but it's under the control of its master. This colt is under the control of its master, and I need to be under the control of mine better than I am. So all these people laying cloaks, and then it says they're laying branches. Now, in John 12, that's the only time that it mentions that what kind of branches they were. John mentions that they were palm branches. But the others just mention branches. Now, why would they be waving branches around? I don't understand. Waving branches doesn't make sense to me. But that's because I'm not acquainted with Leviticus chapter 23. In Leviticus 23, it tells us about all the feast days of Israel. And when you get down to verse 40, while it's describing the feast day of, it's not the feast day, the feast week of the Feast of Booths, that was the feast that immediately followed the Day of Atonement. On the Day of Atonement, the priest would go in and offer atonement for his sins, and he would wash and bathe and change and go back in and offer another sacrifice for the people. Well, on that day, the next 7 days after that is the Feast of Booths. And so everybody would take sticks and branches and they would make up these cute little shelters and they'd live in them for a week. And for a week they'd rejoice. And they'd rejoice by waving palm branches. Waving branches in the air, leafy branches. Now, that sounds crazy to us. But in other countries, you know how they rejoice? They shoot guns up in the air. That's crazy. We don't do that. We shoot off fireworks. They think that's crazy. The Jews wave palm branches. And so they have been associating rejoicing with waving palm branches, but they did that after the Day of Atonement, during the Feast of Booths, in the fall of the year, in the autumn. This is springtime. But they have reason to rejoice because their king is coming to them. So he doesn't have any PR. There's no posters to show what Jesus looked like. So how would they know who he was? Word travels fast. Has he just raised Lazarus from the dead in John 11 before he rides into Jerusalem in John 12? So many people have shared this story that it tells us in John 12 that the chief priests were planning on killing Lazarus because too many people believed in Jesus because of his resurrection. Let's go kill him again, you know? And so there's a crowd of people around Jesus. Oh, did you hear about that? Oh, did you hear about that? And not only that, how about the 5,000 witnesses of the feeding of the 5,000? How about the 4,000 witnesses of the feeding of the 4,000? How about the huge crowd that was with him in Luke 7 when he goes to Nain and another large crowd comes out, and that makes a large crowd plus a large crowd watching him raise the widow of Nain's son from the dead in Luke 7. So they've all told their story, and everybody's heard about Jesus. And so as all these people are coming into Jerusalem, it's estimated that the size of Jerusalem swelled 10 to 12 times in size. I know Josephus exaggerates, but he talks about basically 250,000 fires of people burning sacrifices, burning their Passover lambs for the Passover meal. So, no, I don't think, I think he's stretching it. But the idea is there's a lot of people coming into town. And if you come in from the east, you come over the Mount of Olives. And it's like the fancy way to enter the city, because on that side of the gate is the Gate Beautiful into the temple. And you get to come up those steps from the Kidron Valley. You get to come up the steps and you get to just see the temple gate in all of its glory. And so that's the way people like to come in. So Jesus is up on top, near the top of this mountain. And he comes up, rounds the hill over the top of that mountain, and he's going to start coming down with this crowd of people that's been gathering around him, and the donkey that's still letting him ride. Not because he has to. He wants to. So let's go on. We're still in Mark chapter 11. In verse 9, it says, "Those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, 'Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest.'" Okay? Hosanna basically means, Lord, save. Lord, just save us. See, they'd heard about the saving that he had done. Raising people from the dead, feeding people that were hungry, casting out demons, healing lepers, giving sight to the blind, healing the cripples, the lame. They want him to save them. And from what? They mostly want him to save him from Rome. And a lot of that has to do with their mistaken idea of the kind of Messiah he was supposed to be. They didn't want a Messiah who was going to come in on a cross and defeat Satan and set them free from sin, even though that's what they needed the most and what we needed the most. And he knew that. What they wanted is they wanted a Messiah who was going to come in on a white horse, beat up the Romans, set them free from slavery. They're looking for a physical kingdom. But Jesus will later, toward the end of that week, say to Pontius Pilate in John 18, 36 and 37, he says, "My kingdom's not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting so that I wouldn't be delivered unto you." Okay? So Here's Jesus with this crowd of people, and they're crying out, Hosanna, save us, Lord, save us. The King of David, the kingdom of David. See, when they think kingdom of David, they think David and Goliath. They think David and his mighty sword. They think David and his mighty armies that expanded the territory of Israel all the way up to Damascus in the north and all the way down to the Red Sea in the south. So yeah, we want the kingdom of David back, because it prophesied to Ezekiel that we're going to get the whole kingdom back. And so David's going to be our king. It said so in Ezekiel. That was obviously a figure of Christ who's descended from David. But that's the attitude of all these people. And so they're praising and they're happy. They're thinking, it's going to happen. He's coming to the capital city. He's coming when there's all these people there. It's going to happen. And so they're just rejoicing. They're beside themselves. In John 15, after he fed the 5,000, John 6, verse 14 and 15, when he fed the 5,000. It says afterwards, they tried to take him by force and make him a king, because, hey, if he can take 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish and feed an army, what could he do with 5 swords and 2 spears? Okay. So they're wanting Jesus to be a different kind of king than he needed to be, or that he really was. So picture yourself with this whole crowd coming down into the city. It says, Jesus entered Jerusalem and went to the temple. And he looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. See, every night he goes back to Mary and Martha's house and Lazarus's. He spends his nights in Bethany until it's time. When it's time, he will stay just on the west side. Remember that mountain, the Mount of Olives? On this side is Bethany. Up here is Bethpage, where he gets the donkey colt. He comes down over, and as he gets down almost to the Kidron Valley, right over here, there's a little olive grove that we call the Garden of Gethsemane. And instead of going over the mountain to be safe, he knows it's time to give the sacrifice. And so he stays there. But that won't be until Thursday night. So now he goes back over and he spends the night there. Why? Because he'd just been in and had looked at the temple. Now when he goes in to look at the temple is amazing. He's going to talk about it later on in Mark 13. Also Matthew 24 and Luke 21. When they come out of the temple with his disciples, they see these huge stones. Now, some of those stones were 30 to 45 feet long, one stone. 15 feet by 15 feet. Okay, a cubic foot of rock is about 150 pounds. Multiply that by 30, then multiply that by 15, then multiply that by 15. These are big rocks. How do you move them? So these huge stones are there. So this, when you look at the Wailing Wall today, the Wailing Wall is made from stones that were from another wall built after the destruction of Jerusalem, from the stones from this temple. But they're still huge, even though they're broken in pieces. So imagine these massive stones in the temple. Jesus goes in, and it's ornate, it's beautiful. The temple court is so big you could play 5 soccer games out in the temple court. There's a gold filigree around the edge, and in the back, next to the Antonian fortress on the north side, is a cluster of grapes, 15 feet long, 7.5 feet wide. Solid gold. Yeah. And so this is amazing temple courtyard, this amazing temple, and then the temple itself with these huge brass pillars, and it's just amazing. And then you've got the beautiful gate when you come in. You've got the court of the women. You've got this raised up area when you go into the court of Israel, and around it there are 21 little plaques, and these 21 little plaques say, any Gentile going beyond this point has himself to thank for his ensuing death. Yes, and by the way, we found one of those in archaeology. I love it. But I didn't find it, but I read about somebody else finding it, okay? So here's this amazing temple, and Jesus goes in. But he doesn't see the temple like we see the temple. We know what he sees. He's got this army of people willing to go and fight for him. But that's not the kind of fighting he needs to do. To accomplish what he needs to accomplish, he's going to need to humble himself. He sees the temple, and the temple is filled with sheep, with doves, with money changers. He looks the whole thing over. He is so upset. He is angry, just like he was back in John 2 or 3 years earlier, probably 3 years earlier. So he looks at this marketplace that's in his Father's house, the house of prayer, that they've turned into a den of thieves. He turns around and goes home. Not home, but to Mary and Martha and Lazarus' place back in Bethany. And he spends the night there. And then he comes in on Monday. When he comes in on Monday, it says, verse 12, it says, the next day, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing on it but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. His disciples heard him say it. Now, in Mark and in Luke, the fig tree withers the next day. In Matthew, it withers immediately. Which one's right? Matthew. Why? But see, Mark and Luke weren't there. Mark and Luke got their story, got their information from Peter. Peter probably had his mouth open. Peter was probably talking. Peter wasn't observing the fact that the tree died and immediately. So they missed out on it because Peter missed out on it. But Matthew is right. Well, they were kind of right because the next day it was withered from the roots up. And that's when Peter finally saw it. Matthew is more observant. He's a tax collector. He saw it right away. And so if you ever wonder why there's a difference, they're both right, but it was really dead by the time Peter saw it. And Peter didn't notice it until it was really dead. All right. So he says, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. But Jack, it just said it's not the season for figs. Okay? If you go down to apple tree in March or April, you see all these blossoms all over it. You don't see, well, there's no apples on it, so I'm going to curse this apple tree. Well, it's not the season for apples. It's the season for the blossoms. It's not the season for the apples. It's the same way on these Palestinian fig trees. Remember Amos? Amos, my favorite fig pinching sheep herder, okay, in the Old Testament, in Amos 7. Amos, his job is to be a pruner of sycamore figs and a shepherd. And I think it's in chapter 7. Anyway, he goes down to take care of these figs. And what he does, these big, thick, watery blossoms grow on a fig tree, and his job is to pinch them. Because if he does, they'll produce sweeter figs when they ripen. So I told people that Amos was my fig pinching sheep herder. Well, these blossoms, they have liquid in them. And travelers would come up to fig trees. Now, fig trees are not like little apple trees. A fig tree can be like 80 feet across and 60 feet high. Huge. But all the figs grow on sprouts, little branches off of the central trunk. And so he goes and he looks for these little blossoms because travelers don't have water fountains, but they can get moisture. It's not real sweet. It's kind of like, have you ever eaten maple sap? Maple sap's not very sweet. It takes like 40 gallons of maple sap to boil down to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. Well, that's kind of the way these are. They're kind of sweet, but they're not that sweet. They're mostly watery. And so people would just grab some to quench their thirst and go on their way. Well, he goes looking for one of these little, he's not looking for figs. It doesn't say he's looking for figs. He's looking for these fruit that were going to become figs next fall, next summer, during the summer. And so it doesn't have any. And he curses it. Why? Because it's already out in leaf. If it's out in leaf and it doesn't have these blossoms, later on it's not going to have any figs. Okay? And so that's why he said, so anyway, He then goes into the temple. It says, verse 15, on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those who were selling doves, and he wouldn't allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves? A house of prayer for all nations, he says, but you have made it a den of robbers. Now, I want you to picture Jesus. He comes in, and these guys are ripping off faithful worshipers of God. When they come in with the lamb that they've been caring for and bringing in so that they can have for the Passover, the best one from their flocks, they go, oh no, this one has a blemish on it. All animals have a blemish on it. You know, I got moles here, and I got all these spots. Everything has a blemish on it. God's saying you don't give lame animals. You don't give really bad animals. You give the best you've got. This is the best they had. But the priest said, oh no, it's blemished. And we knew people would do that. So we have these other lambs that are not blemished, and you can choose one of them. So he goes to sell his, but oh, we won't give you much because it's blemished. And then he goes to buy the other one, and he goes, oh man, that's a lot of money. And so he goes to pay for it, and they go, oh no, we can't take your money. Why? Well, because your money is a denarius. That's a Roman. It's got the image of Caesar on it. We can't have images in the temple. So you have to go to the money changers over there, and they'll take your money and turn it into shekels. A denarius is 240 grains of silver. A shekel is only 220. So they're getting a 10% take on every one of these days changeover. So the money changers are doing great. They're making money. They're making silver. And they're ripping them off there. They're ripping them off by charging them too much for the sheep. They're ripping them off by not paying enough for their sheep. If they don't have enough money, they wind up having to buy turtle doves because they don't have enough money even to buy a sheep. And that way, that's not much fun for a Passover meal, eating 2 pigeons instead of eating a lamb. That's just wrong, okay? Jesus sees them being abused, and he says, it's time. So he just cleans out. He drives out the money changers. He turns over their tables. All the silver goes every which way. He chases out them with the animals, with the birds. He lets them all go. Now, it says the chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this, and they began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. Every night, where they go, they're heading back to Bethany. They want to go back over the hill, back to the other side. So, the religious leaders kind of run the town. But not now. There's a crowd, there's an army of people following Jesus. And I want us to understand this army of people willing to follow Jesus so much that the religious leaders, with all of their power, are scared to death of him. All right? By Thursday, and we'll talk about this next Sunday, but by Thursday, they're saying, crucify him, crucify him. That breaks my heart. How could they go from being so loyal to Jesus, so hopeful, so rejoicing and waving branches and crying out, Hosanna, Son of David, to crying out, crucify him, crucify him? We'll talk about that one next week. But while you are where you are, know that God absolutely loves you. And we need to rejoice. Sometimes we just look at the dying of Jesus and miss out on the rejoicing. In fact, as you commune, hopefully later this morning, as you commune, we don't celebrate that on Friday when he died. We celebrate that on Sunday when he was raised. Jesus is risen. So we're going to get through this virus. We're going to get through whatever comes our way. Hug the people close to you. Show kindness and communicate as best you can with whatever means you can with others. And may God richly bless you and Jesus give you peace.